Good evening on this Tuesday, August 30th, 2011. This is the 28storms.com tropical weather update. But first, before we go ahead and get started, I would like to welcome our new audience from the Hurricane Tracker app. This is a new feature that will be available for daily consumption here at the Hurricane Tracker app throughout the remainder of the 2011 hurricane season. But we have a lot to talk about this evening, so let's get right on into what is occurring in the tropics. We will start off by looking at the latest outlook from the National Hurricane Center. And evidently, we now have Tropical Storm Katia located out there in the central Atlantic. That storm will more than likely become the next hurricane within the next 6 to 12 hours. But more importantly, at least in the short term, we now have a new feature, and we mentioned this in yesterday's video. We need to keep a very close watch on the Northwest Caribbean, and especially the Gulf of Mexico. Once this tropical disturbance begins to move more toward the northwest, the National Hurricane Center is giving this feature a 10% chance of formation within the next 48 hours, but the potential is likely to increase in the 3 to 5 day range. A broad satellite overview reveals that we have a lot of disorganized shower and thunderstorm activity off the east coast United States, although nothing is organizing at this time. But once again, here's that new tropical disturbance. This is a lot of disorganized and shower activity associated with a tropical wave that is inching toward the northwest, and once again, that will be the main feature to watch for in the short term as it poses the greatest threat to land. But also, if we look into the central and eastern Atlantic, we see that Tropical Storm Katia has become a lot better defined over the last 24 hours. In fact, it's on the verge of becoming a hurricane based on the latest satellite representation. If we go ahead and view the latest infrared satellite imagery, we see that convection in the Western Caribbean still isn't all that organized yet, and we don't have any strong indications of a low-level circulation beginning to form. We're not expecting any development to be overly imminent, but this again will be the area to watch as it moves into the Northwest Gulf within the next 3 to 5 days. And of course, we'll just have to keep a very close watch on Katia, but thankfully it's still very far out and is still several days away from the Caribbean if it were to even affect some of those islands. If we took a look at the upper-level atmospheric conditions using water vapor imagery, we can see that the conditions over the tropical disturbance in the Caribbean are not all that favorable just yet. We still have a mid to upper level disturbance located between Jamaica and Hispaniola, and that's funneling in a lot of northerly wind shear, so this is not the most ideal pattern for development just yet. However, there are indications that the upper level ridging is a little bit more intense over Central America, and the model guidance is expecting this upper level ridge to begin spreading northbound into the Gulf of Mexico, which is the time then that when we expect some development to occur. Also, if we look toward Tropical Storm Katia, and as we observed its surrounding environment, we see that there is quite a lot of dry air over the central Atlantic, but this typically is not a very significant factor as long as the upper level wind shear remains light. And furthermore, if we go ahead and turn on the latest sea surface temperatures, we see that this storm is steadily moving into warmer waters with time, so the dry air should not be inhibiting enough to really disrupt any steady intensification. In fact, based on the latest conditions that I'm looking at, it looks as though this storm will have no problem becoming the second major hurricane of the 2011 season, especially within a 5 to 6 day period. This system should be somewhere to the northeast of Puerto Rico over the next 5 to 6 days. Now, with all that being said, though, all interests along the eastern Caribbean need to still pay a lot of attention to this system in case the upper level pattern were to change and place more of the Caribbean at least some additional risk. As of the official 5 p.m. advisory from the National Hurricane Center, maximum sustained winds had already increased to 60 miles per hour, and based on the latest trends on satellite imagery, I would not be surprised if those winds were already a bit higher. And as you can see, the storm is moving off toward the west-northwest at 20 miles per hour, and by 2 p.m. Sunday, the storm is forecast to be a major hurricane sitting just to the northeast of the Virgin Islands. The additional good news is that the tropical model plots are in fairly good agreement with the official Hurricane Center track that takes this just to the north of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. However, interests there, once again, are still advised to keep an eye on the system in case some of this guidance were to begin dropping more toward the south. But as of right now, the highest likelihood is that this storm will remain just toward the north. Now, despite the more northerly track, or the expected track to the north of the Caribbean, that's not to say that the U.S. East Coast is off the hook just yet, although this forecast is a good 10 days away. So this is very far out in terms of any U.S. East Coast impact, and we cannot definitively say whether or not this storm will make a direct impact on the weather across the U.S. eastern seaboard. So the best advice I can give you today is to just keep a very close eye on this storm as it continues to progress toward the west-northwest. Next up, we will go through a very quick round of analysis maps, and this is the latest wind shear with the color representation turned on. As we can see, we have a lot of wind shear between 30 and 45 knots across much of the central Atlantic to the north of 20 degrees north latitude. However, all of the dynamical models and the tropical intensity models are expecting that the upper level ridge located directly over the tropical cyclone will also continue to spread west-northwest along with it, so that trough to the north should be bumped further away from the system with time. And once again, we still have some northerly winds here in excess of 20 to 30 knots here around Jamaica and our tropical wave, but as this feature begins to move more toward the west-northwest, we already see signs of upper-level ridging taking shape across much of Central America, I should say, and this is expected to lift more toward the north into the Gulf of Mexico with time. As mentioned before, there are no signs of a developing low-level circulation associated with that tropical wave in the western Caribbean just yet. However, we are seeing some signs that the 850 millibar low-level vorticity is beginning to rise, so this could be one hot spot to look for in case this system does begin to develop a low-level surface circulation within the next 24 to 48 hours. And of course, our tropical storm Katia is looking very healthy today out here to the southwest of the Cape Verde Islands. The low-level steering setup is quite different in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico compared to when we had Tropical Storm Harvey. Recently, we had a very powerful mid-level ridge over much of the southeast United States that drove Harvey well into Central America, but this time around that ridge is not quite as intense as it used to be, and in fact it's displaced a little bit more toward the east right now in the low levels. And this general pattern is expected to persist over the next few days, so this tropical wave should have no trouble getting into the central Gulf of Mexico and more than likely the northwest Gulf between Louisiana and Texas. So this is going to be the hot spot to look for in the coming days. We're going to start off looking at some of the latest 12Z dynamical model guidance, starting off with the CMC model. This is the 500 millibar relative vorticity forecast, and typically you can't see weak tropical systems quite as good when you look this high up in the atmosphere, but you can still make out developing tropical cyclones fairly well, in addition to making out the overall steering pattern. So as we can see, when we start off at the 0 hour, we can see that the tropical disturbance in the Caribbean is already becoming a little bit better visible here. And as we advance this into the 6-day forecast time range, we see that the CMC model quite definitely develops this feature into a tropical cyclone, more than likely a tropical storm here, as it begins to move a little bit closer toward the Texas coast. And if I go ahead and loop this again one more time, the model is still suggesting that there will be enough ridging over interior Texas to eventually shunt this system more toward the west between Corpus Christi and Brownsville, Texas, and then eventually into northern Mexico. In the meantime, it's also continuing to develop Tropical Storm Katia. As we can see, the storm is expected to move west-northwest around the western periphery of the subtropical ridge, but as we go into day 6, this model at least is entertaining the idea of some trough reinforcement over the U.S. eastern seaboard, and hopefully if we get enough troughing, or at least persistent troughing, over the western Atlantic within 5 to 10 days, then perhaps this storm will be able to recurve east of the United States, unlike Hurricane Irene. One thing that isn't so fortunate is that the forecast, especially for the Gulf disturbance, is not quite as clear-cut as the Canadian CMC may lead some people to believe. For example, we're going to now look at the latest 12Z GFS forecast. Once again, this is the 500 millibar pattern, and as we advance this into the first few days, we begin to see signs of an organizing tropical system in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's not quite as fast as the CMC indicates, but especially by day 4, we're beginning to see somewhat of a vorticity max here to the south of New Orleans. And as we continue into day 5, notice that the GFS is really not showing quite as much movement as the CMC was indicating, and there is some model disagreement here, and the big key is this trough that's beginning to enter the picture from the Midwest. Now, in this particular model, the GFS is indicating that that trough will be strong enough to break down the mid-level ridge to the north, and that would allow the tropical cyclone to inch a little bit closer to Louisiana. However, even this model is not showing the trough digging south quite enough to fully pick up the storm, and therefore, as we go into day 6 and beyond, the storm is left behind over the western Gulf of Mexico and is left meandering around the western Gulf throughout the rest of the period. Now, there is some agreement in terms of Tropical Storm Katia. The CMC and the GFS are in very good agreement with taking this trough or amplifying this trough over the western Atlantic, and that should be enough to steer this storm away from the U.S. East Coast as we go into days 7 through 10. However, we've seen how tricky these forecasts, especially in the extended range, can be, so I do not want to act like that this forecast is completely edged in stone just yet. The latest 12Z European model forecast shows both of our systems fairly well as we go into the next few days. This is day 1, 2, and day 3. Now, one thing that is somewhat interesting to note is that the European is not quite developing the tropical storm in the Western Gulf quite as much as it did 12 hours ago, but it's still showing a lowering of surface pressures and is still indicating at least some type of marginal development as we go into day 4. And we see a 1006 millibar surface low located to the east of northern Mexico and southeast of Brownsville, Texas. In the meantime, our tropical storm and developing hurricane should still pass to the north of the Caribbean. As we can see, there is still a weakness here in the western Atlantic ridge. We still have some troughing, and this trough is expected to be reinforced, much like the CMC and GFS were indicating, especially as we go into day 6 and day 7. We still have that trough up there, and if the timing is correct, then this storm should still recurve away from the U.S. East Coast. Now, this could be problematic for interest in Bermuda, but once again, this is extremely far out and subject to significant changes. And of course, if we go back to the Gulf of Mexico for one moment, the European has a slightly different take on things, but overall is not that far off from the GFS forecast, with a meandering low in the western Gulf throughout day 7. And in fact, if we really take this far out into days 8 through 10, we see that the European is developing several small-scale lows across both the western and eastern Gulf throughout the forecast period. So just to recap, Tropical Storm Katia should have no trouble becoming the next hurricane and even major hurricane of the 2011 hurricane season. At this time, it still looks like it's going to pass just to the north of the Caribbean, but interest there cannot let their guard down just yet. It's way too far out to say whether or not this storm will directly impact the U.S. East Coast. And as far as any development in the Gulf of Mexico, it's still at least a few days away, even if it were to happen. So we really cannot tell you much more than that at this time. But interest from especially northern Mexico all the way northward through Texas and the Louisiana coastline should begin to keep up with the tropics just a little bit more than you ordinarily would. Right now, there's really not enough evidence to really suggest that we will have a significant tropical cyclone, but there are certainly some earmarks or tendencies that would indicate that we could have some development into a tropical depression or tropical storm. So thanks again for stopping by, and please visit 28storms.com, or if you're on the go ahead and check out your Hurricane Tracker app. Again, that's available on iPhone and iPad for the latest tropical weather video analysis.